Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. I've always had a weird relationship with the Doors. I like their music, but I often struggle to connect with it, to really get it in the way I think it was meant to be heard. It's a product of a very different era from the one I grew up in, and while I enjoy their songs when they come on the radio, I've never really felt like it was for me. Except for one song. People Are Strange, the lead single off their second album, is everything I want in a rock song. No, scratch that, it's everything I want in a song, period. It's got a dark, complex soundscape, a driving groove, and a cryptic story that's enticing without giving away too many details. And best of all, it does all that in just over 2 minutes, so I'm sure it won't take very long to analyze. Don't look at the runtime. Here's a puppy, look at that instead. It's the one Doors song I really feel like I can relate to, so when my friend Matt asked me to make a video about the Doors, I immediately knew which one I wanted to talk about. Let's take it apart. Before we get started, this video is a collaboration with my friend Matt from The Beat Goes On. He did a whole video about the history of the Doors as a companion piece to this one, and once you're done here, you should really check it out. There's a link in the description. Anyway, the song starts like this, immediately previewing the disorienting atmosphere that runs through the whole piece. Guitarist Robbie Krieger is playing a simple walk down the E minor scale, but it's incomplete. After the G, we'd expect F sharp, but he just skips right over it and goes to the root early. And it's not just a missing note, it's also a missing beat. The song is in 4/4, so there should be 4 quarter notes here. Or, okay, technically it's in 12/8, but either way, there's 4 beats per bar. Point is, both metrically and melodically, there's clearly supposed to be an F sharp here, but Krieger skips it, so the start of the verse feels weird and unprepared. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, hold on 12 Tone, they don't need an F sharp here. This could just be the minor pentatonic scale, which doesn't use that note. And why are we assuming this is the downbeat anyway? Pickups often start partway through the bar. Maybe the missing beat is at the beginning, not the end. And to that I say, yeah, good point. But I can prove I'm not the only one who hears this note as implied. The cult classic vampire film The Lost Boys includes this song, but it doesn't use the Doors version. Instead, it has a cover by Echo and the Bunnymen, and that cover starts like this. I'm not sure if this was an intentional change or if they just misremembered the line, but if we compare it to the original, people are strange, you can really hear how the F sharp makes it feel a lot more balanced. The tension of the pickup is basically gone, and that feeds into the entire verse. And that makes sense. The Echo cover is meant to be part of a movie, so it's going for a more ambient creepiness to support the rest of the action. But as a standalone work of art, the Doors have more space to be aggressively unstable. Dropping this one little note throws everything else into chaos, and the song never really gives you a chance to catch back up. From there, Krieger launches into the first verse, and we need to talk about the 12/8 thing. This is basically just 4/4 with triplets, and he's playing a shuffle groove, emphasizing the first and third eighths in each beat while mostly avoiding hitting the middle one. Or more specifically, he's playing a shuffle tresillo. Normally, I describe a tresillo as what happens when you take a bar with 8 eighth notes and try to split it up into 3 parts. You can't do it evenly, so you wind up having to shorten this last attack to fit the bar line, giving you this lopsided galloping rhythm. But here we have 12/8 notes per bar, which we can divide evenly into 3 parts. But that's not actually the point of a tresillo. The point is that it's supposed to be a little uneven. A more precise description, then, is that a tresillo is what you get when you place accents on beat 1, beat 4, and then the note halfway between them. But now 12/8 becomes ambiguous. The halfway point is in between these 2 eighth notes, so we have to apply the logic of the shuffle groove. Again, in a shuffle, we mostly hide the middle note, so if we have to pick one of these 2, it should probably be the last one. Taken together, this gives us a tresillo-like figure where every accent is spaced slightly differently, adding even more complexity to an already exciting pattern. I should note that no one else in the band plays this pattern, it's just Krieger and basically just in this first verse, but we'll get into that later. Next, let's talk chords. He plays just enough E minor to establish the key, moves to A minor for most of the phrase, and then ends with a quick turnaround from B back to E. Spending so long on the 4 chord gives it a haunting, directionless vibe. The 4 chord is like a harmonic liminal space meant to shuttle you from the 1 to the 5, but here it hangs for an interminably long time with only a ghost of a resolution at the end when the song finally remembers where it's supposed to go. There's actually a little more going on in this progression, but in order to see that, we have to stop thinking of it as chords and start thinking about arpeggios. The first bar lays out the basic pattern. He starts by walking up an E power chord, before hitting an open G string on that accented tresillo beat. He hangs there for a moment, then starts walking back down the voicing, adding in this B-flat passing tone to set up the next chord root. If he just repeated the B, the following A would sound a little disjointed. You wouldn't get such a strong landing, so the out-of-key passing tone not only adds to the dark, spooky atmosphere of the track, it also glues the chords together. The second bar roughly follows the same shape, again walking up a power chord, in this case A5, before hitting that same open G. This turns it into an A minor 7, except no, it doesn't. If I'm going to be really precise in my transcription here, there's one other thing that happens at the same time. Here, I'll play it again. I'll even digitally remove the G to make it easier to hear what's going on with the A string. Did you catch it? The root of the chord seems to slide up to B. It's really subtle. My best guess is that instead of just lifting up his finger to get that open G, he actually returns his entire hand to the E minor shape from the first bar, resulting in a tiny little hammer-on as the impact of his finger sets the A string in motion. He doesn't pluck it, but that sounds like where his hand is. But this move doesn't appear in any transcription or tutorial video I could find, including a guitar lesson uploaded in 2020 by Robbie Krieger himself, and with good reason. It's pretty much impossible to hear in the full mix. It's a notation ghost, there in principle, but not in practice. So, does it matter? Not really, at least not on its own, but it does tell us something about how Krieger is thinking about the harmony. I said the middle 2 bars were one long A minor chord, but based on what his hands are doing, he's probably viewing this open G as a return to E minor. And we can see that again in the next bar, where he skips the G and instead plucks a double stop of B and E. And later on, once the full band comes in, they also play an E chord here, so while at first it might seem like a long, static A minor, it's actually got this rapid oscillation back and forth between the 4 and 1 chords, giving it depth without really compromising the wandering nature of the progression. On top of that sits Jim Morrison's vocals. People are strange when you're a stranger. And hey, look, it's a melodic motif. I love a good melodic motif. Each bar of this melody works basically the same way, loosely following Krieger's arpeggio. Morrison starts on the same note, but while Krieger walks up a power chord, Morrison just does this upper neighbor tone instead, to keep the line comfortably within his relatively limited vocal range. Just for fun, here's what it'd sound like if he actually followed Krieger exactly. People are strange when you're a stranger. That could work, I guess, but it'd be annoying to sing. It loses the relaxed conversational tone you get from such a small, contained melody. He almost sounds like he's speaking the line, which actually he does wind up doing later on. After the neighbor tone, regardless of the notes they were on, he then moves to a G, mirroring the harmony's return to E minor. People are strange when you're a stranger. The only exception is in the final bar, when you're alone, where he instead resolves it back to the root to complete the phrase. It's a simple little figure well suited for a not very technical singer like Morrison. It gives the character of his voice a chance to shine without having to wrestle through a bunch of unnecessary vocal gymnastics. There's enough flourishes to keep it interesting, but he's mainly a storyteller, and this melody lets him focus on telling his story. In the first bar, he stops after G, but in the second, we see him introduce his main rhythmic figure. It's like Krieger's shuffle tresillo, but he sings the last syllable in 8th note early. When you're a stranger. In a tresillo, the last attack is the shortest, so it feels like it's getting cut off by the bar line. By pulling it forward a bit, that pressure is released, giving the line a greater sense of closure, even as the syncopation adds some extra bounce. In this section, with just voice and guitar, you can also hear a sort of rhythmic handoff, as Morrison ends his phrase early, passing the baton to Krieger to take the spotlight for a second in the gaps between vocal lines. When you're a stranger, faces look ugly. It's a nice little back and forth moment that keeps the song moving forward. But of course, this section doesn't last forever. Near the end of it, Morrison starts to abandon the melody, falling to a low B and then just speaking the final line.
Streets are uneven when you're down.
That change in tone is a signal for the rest of the band that it's time to start the chorus, and everyone comes crashing in at once. Krieger backs off, switching to just backbeat chord stabs to make space for everyone else. And he stays there for most of the rest of the song. Morrison's melody becomes even simpler, mostly just alternating between G and B to match the harmony.
When you're strange, faces come out of the rain.
But what is the harmony? For that, we have to turn to Rayman Zarek. Or actually, first, let's talk timbre. He's double-tracked here, playing two instruments. The sound of his part is a mix between a Vox Continental organ and attack piano. This is like a normal piano, but with thumbtacks applied to the ends of the striking hammers, so when they hit the strings, you get this harsh, metallic, inharmonic buzz alongside the note. It's meant to evoke a sort of old-timey, slightly out-of-tune piano sound, and combined with the ethereal, slightly tinny tone of the organ in the background, the section takes on an almost carnival-like sound, transforming the piece from merely dark into something otherworldly. It's a visceral, audible sense of strangeness that provides a window into the deeper potential meanings of Morrison's lyrics. But okay, harmony. There's no E minor here. That's still the key, but the chord itself is missing. In its place, we have B7, the 5 chord, and then G major, the flat 3. Avoiding the 1 chord amplifies that otherworldly atmosphere, leaving the harmony feeling ungrounded and a little unreal, like we've stepped through a portal to some new dimension of spooky clowns. But as for the chords we do have... Okay, so the devil on my shoulder that tells me to use fancy academic words to sound smart wants me to say that Erno Lenvi's axis theory provides a satisfying analysis of this resolution. If you know what that means, great. If not, I've got you. Basically, if we want to resolve to G major, the most obvious way to do it is with D7. That's your classic 5-1 resolution, also called a dominant resolution. Although, since we're in E minor, this isn't actually the 1 chord, so if we want to get technical, then, why stop now? It's what's called a secondary dominant. That just means we stole the 5 chord from a different key. But D7's not the only chord we could steal. We could instead do a tritone substitution, where you replace the 5 chord with another dominant 7th whose root is a tritone away. In this case, that's a flat 7. And it works because the thirds and sevenths of the 2 chords are the same. D7 has F sharp and C, while A flat 7 has C and G flat, which is the same thing as F sharp. These 2 notes drive the resolution, so we can swap back and forth between the 2 chords and still resolve to all the same places. But we're still not there yet. The next option is a backdoor resolution, where we approach the target chord with a dominant 7th a whole step below it, in this case F7, and we can, again, swap that out for its tritone substitution, which finally gets us to B. It's the tritone substitution of the backdoor variation on a secondary dominant. Easy. Do you see how smart this makes me look? But still, why do this? Why use such a convoluted harmonic relationship instead of just, normal chords? Well, that's why I don't usually listen to that devil on my shoulder, because these absolutely are normal chords. B7 is the 5 chord in E, and it's there to imply a resolution back to E minor, just like it did in the verse. It's just that resolution gets subverted, which is interesting. G is the relative major here, which means it shares all the same notes with the key of E minor. G could, in theory, be the root of this song, and all the notes and chords would still make sense. It's not, but it could be. This gives the flat 3 chord a very similar harmonic function to the 1, but because it doesn't contain the root, it's harder to resolve to. We have to bust out a pretty esoteric theoretical model in order to explain why the D sharp doesn't just go up to E like we'd expect. So if I was going to try to explain these chords in a way that was actually useful, I'd say it's a harmonic misdirect, combining the implied function of the B7, the relative brightness of the G major, and the tenuous but plausible resolution between the two, in order to keep you off balance. It's like a funhouse mirror version of the 5-1 resolution, distorted just enough to sound uncanny without stretching so far as to be unrecognizable. The Doors didn't have to know about axis theory. They couldn't have. Lenvi hadn't even published it yet. All they had to do was find a cool chord motion that resolved, but not quite right. And that effect is amplified by the phrase structure. You probably know that in Western popular music, we like groups of 2, so phrases are typically 2, 4, or 8 bars long. But here, that's sort of what's happening. Like, there's a clear 2-bar phrase, but then instead of getting the next one right away, there's this big rhythm stop.
Faces come out of the rain when you strain.
As if they just realized they played the wrong chord and are looking to reset and try again. Krieger punctuates this stop with a high bend that aims toward a B, but doesn't always make it all the way there, while Manzarek drops a quick chord stab on B7 again, and then Morrison comes in to fill the gap with his brief jump up to... I think he's going for a D sharp, but it winds up as a sort of blue note sitting in between D and D sharp for expressive effect. This uneven start-stop pattern throws off any sense of normal metric behavior here, instead calling to mind the sort of awkward outsider character portrayed by the lyrics. Those empty pauses give you space to reflect on the strangeness of the song, and to my ears at least, the moments of silence actually highlight the unusual timbre of the tack piano, preventing it from simply starting to feel normal. Turning to John Densmore's drums, it'd be easy to mistake this for a straightforward rock beat. But it's not. Or, the bones are there. We've got a kick on 1 and 3, a ride cymbal on all the quarter notes, and then, something on the backbeat. But it's not a snare. In fact, it's not even consistent. On beat 2 of each bar, he does this little bounce on the low tom, which sort of blends into the mix, while beat 4 has a cross stick that cuts through much more effectively, giving the impression of only one drum accent per bar. And that accent lines up really beautifully with Manzarek. In the first bar at least, he plays this ascending line through the upper structure of a B7 chord, anticipating the last attack, and then Densmore's cross stick comes in right after to punctuate it. It's a lovely little conversation between the two rhythms, kinda like we saw between Morrison and Krieger in the verse. These fake snare hits also make it way more impactful when, during the rhythm stop, he finally plays an actual snare hit, along with Krieger's bend and Manzarek's stab. It's a small touch, and this part would have worked fine with normal snare hits throughout, but it's a clever idea, and I feel like I don't highlight the drums enough in these videos, so I wanted to mention the cool thing he was doing. And finally, there's the bass. Now you might be thinking, hold on 12-tone, what are you talking about? The Doors famously didn't have a bassist. And yeah, that's sort of true. They never had a permanent member playing bass, and for live performances, Manzarek would typically handle the low end on his organ, but, well, here's what that sounds like.
When you're strange, faces come out of the rain.
Don't get me wrong, it's fine, certainly good enough for live, but it's a little thin for such a dark, brooding song. Manzarek's electric organ doesn't have the same weight or power as a real bass guitar, so for most of their studio albums, the band brought in a session bassist, in this case Doug Luban, to fill it out. This sort of melodic quarter note pattern played against a shuffle groove calls to mind a walking bass, a staple of jazz, used to give the music more of a forward trajectory than you'd get from just hitting the root over and over. But there's a really subtle, important choice going on with the notes. The first bar is leaping all over the place, but if we ignore this first B, it's spending the whole time on F sharp in different octaves. F sharp is the fifth of the chord, which isn't usually very important. It's really stable, so bass lines often emphasize it to avoid sounding dissonant, but as we said before, the main notes driving a dominant resolution are the 3rd and 7th. Or at least that would be true if we were going to E minor, but we're not. We're fainting away to G, and while F sharp is a stable, boring 5th under a B7, it also happens to be a half step below the root of that target chord, serving as a sort of pseudo-leading tone that makes that tenuous resolution a little bit stronger. They repeat that awkward 3-bar phrase twice, starting and stopping like an engine that's about to die, then they get stuck in a holding pattern, looping the B7 over and over for a bit, before setting up the next verse with that same walkdown from the beginning, except this time they do include the F sharp. And all I have to say about that is, I told you so. So right, second verse. The whole band is in now, creating a wildly different texture. Krieger sticks with his chord stabs, so the arpeggio from the beginning is gone for good. Manzarek is a lot more explicit about those E chords in the A minor bars, confirming our theory that this was the intended harmony all along, and in the second half he starts to double Morrison's melody, which will come up again later. Densmore does switch to a basic rock groove, punctuating the end of each 4-bar phrase with a big fill to maintain momentum. And Morrison's part is basically exactly the same until the very end, where instead of dropping low and speaking the last lines, he sits on a relatively high note and wails them out instead.
Streets are uneven when you're down.
To build energy for the coming solo. The most interesting part, though, is actually Luban's. Remember how in the first verse, Krieger's arpeggio used that open G as a consistent high point to anchor the harmony? Luban does a similar thing, first walking up an E power chord to a high E on beat 3, then arpeggiating an A minor triad, topping out on that same high E on the same beat. This obscures the changing harmony. It's the root of the new chord, but also the logical next step in the previous arpeggio. The end of this verse builds up again like it's about to return to the chorus, but instead Krieger comes in with a guitar solo. Underneath him, Manzarek is laying out a new set of chords. He starts on B7 again, like the chorus, but instead of G major, he drops into this low, crunchy voicing of an E minor 7 sus4. It's an interesting subversion of the chorus progression. In principle, going to an E chord is a stronger resolution, but the sudden change in register, along with the voicing that puts the A and the B right next to each other, gives it its own kind of disquiet, strange in a new and different way. But okay, solo time. Krieger starts by unbending from B to A, then a rapid run down an octave before bending back up from A to B. Both bends are slow enough to give you a moment on B flat, the tritone of the key, so clearly he's thinking blues scale. That's not surprising, but it is important. From there, he slides back up to the higher register, launching all the way up to a high G. When I'm analyzing solos, I often like to think about directionality. Solos are typically pretty goal-oriented, so where they end and how they approach that ending are hugely important to their impact. Starting low and working your way up leads to a triumphant moment of catharsis, whereas starting high and slowly gliding down allows for a smooth transition out. This solo does neither. Or it does both. I don't know, whichever. It starts out kinda high, and while there is an immediate drop, overall it seems to be trending upward. This G is noticeably higher than the B he started on. And it's easy to imagine an alternate version of the solo where that keeps going, building intensity up to a piercing climactic high root at the very end. But instead, he walks down the scale, and never really makes it this high again. The next phrase starts lower than either of them, with these bends from E to F sharp, then even lower to B, before ending up on a low E. We get our moment of catharsis early with that ecstatic high G, then trail off, which makes sense. Those big, screeching high solos with explosive endings carry a lot of energy with them into the next section, so they need a next section that can absorb that energy. But that's not this song. Instead, the solo ends with another bar-long rhythm stop,
When you're strange,
releasing a lot of the solo's excitement and resetting back to a more muted level that supports Morrison's conversational delivery. Krieger needs to wind back down so the transition doesn't feel too jarring. Once it picks back up, the second chorus is basically the same as the first. The only big difference I could find is that those stopping bars tacked on to the first couple phrases have become a bit more lively,
faces come out of the rain when you're strange.
with Densmore playing a couple hits and Krieger stretching out his bend from a short stab into a slow wail that fills most of the bar. Then they do the walk down again, and it's Manzarek's turn to take a solo over the verse progression. Or I say solo, but instead of following Krieger's lead, Manzarek basically just plays the melody again. This is one of my favorite types of solo because it feels so closely connected to the rest of the music. Something like Krieger's solo could work in a lot of songs, but this one really only works in People Are Strange. It ties itself beautifully to the rest of the song's musical identity. But he's not literally copying Morrison. He starts out that way, but in the second half he starts to harmonize the line in thirds, then changes the melodic shape, breaking off from the main motif and switching to an ascending figure. It's based on the main melody, but it's evolving it in interesting ways. This also results in a very different contour. Krieger's solo ran all up and down the neck, covering a little over 2 octaves in total. But since Manzarek is basically trapped by Morrison's melody, his solo stays in a much smaller space. It doesn't have the same peaks and valleys that Krieger does, but inasmuch as it has a trajectory, it's clearly pointing up. The addition of a higher harmony line on the second half and the melodic changes that go along with it both gesture in that direction, because the final chorus they're setting up is much bigger. Here, I'll play you the vocals, see if you notice anything different.
When your strange faces come out of the rain.
Yeah, it's a huge gang vocals choir. That was pretty obvious. Some sources I found say this is Morrison tracked a bunch of times, others say it's the rest of the band. I'm inclined to believe the latter, but I don't know for sure. Anyway, none of them seem to be harmonizing or anything, it's just one big unison line with a bunch of voices. It's a simple way to ramp up the dynamics for a final chorus, but it's also a satisfying conclusion to the song's narrative. The lyrics are all about being an outsider, and while the words haven't changed here, layering in this many voices seems to say that we're all outsiders, strangers in our own strange ways. The album cover for Strange Days shows a bunch of what look like circus performers doing their thing, celebrating their collective uniqueness together, and this final chorus feels like we finally arrived there. But that's not the only change. The stopping bars are now completely filled in,
Faces come out of the rain. When you're strange.
and Krieger finally drops the chord stabs and starts arpeggiating again, tying us back to the intro. At the end, they do one last stop with everyone but Morrison dropping out, then Krieger comes back in by himself, arpeggiating a B7 chord.
When you're strange.
Then he leans into the whammy bar, raising the pitch slightly so it's no longer even pointing back to E, and hangs on it forever, leaving you with an ambiguous dissonance that never fully resolves. And that's pretty much it. If you want to know more about how this song fits into the overall history of the Doors, check out the video By the Beat Goes On for a lot more information on that. There's a link in the description, it's a really fun video. And beyond that, thanks for watching. This was a really fun video to experiment with. I've been wanting to talk about the Doors for a really long time, but as I mentioned at the start of the video, I feel a little weird about presenting myself as an expert on them for most songs. So when Matt came to me with this idea, it seemed like a great opportunity to dive into some music that I liked, but wasn't as familiar with as I might want to be. I do usually select these songs by Patreon poll, and I did this one as well. I just put 4 Doors songs on there to make sure that I would get one of them. I know at the beginning I said that this was the one I definitely wanted to talk about, so Patreon patrons, if you were wondering about that, that is true. I just wanted to make sure y'all were cool with this being the song I talked about too, so I gave some other options just to make sure. Speaking of patrons, I do need to thank my featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Feather Sutherland, John Hancock, Neil Moore, and Jeff, all of whose contributions go a long way toward making this channel continue to work. These videos, as I've mentioned before, are my full-time job, and even though I didn't have any in January, I was working ahead on other things. I was also at MagFest. I don't know if any of you watching this were at MagFest. That was super fun. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that here because this is the end of a video that's not about that. But I might wind up making a video later about some of the stuff I did there. If you were there and you saw that, feel free to let me know if that would be something you'd want to see. But yeah, beyond that, I'm just going to go with the typical ending. You know how it goes. You could probably say it with me. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, as always, keep on rockin'. Yeah, my voice kind of stumbled there. I had a little thing in my throat. I'm going to try that again. Keep on rockin'.